White supremacists took it upon themselves to police the boundaries of the color line. They were judge, jury, and executioner, substituting lynch law for the legal system. It's really beginning in the 1880s and by the 1890s that we see the explosion of this form of vigilante violence, of mob terror directed towards the African American community. The overarching purpose of the violence is really control and the ability to impose white supremacy on the South and ultimately on the entire nation. And as lynching becomes something that happens more and more in American society, it often takes on a more ritualistic character. There was one idea that white people did not challenge, is that it was their destiny, their God-given right to be in charge of the South. It was their obligation to domineer over black people. That took lots of different forms. It could go all the way from the most brutal and simple violence to these elaborate rewriting of a constitution. The goal was to make sure that this remains a white man's country. We sit in America and often judge violence that's perpetuated in other societies, how barbarian they are. Well, we've done the same thing. The problem is that is not talked about in American society. We skip over the violence to try, on many levels, to hide from it. I remember I read Of the Coming of John in The Souls of Black Folk, and that was my first encounter with lynching. And it haunted me. It frightened me, and it's something I always thought about whenever I saw images of people in the South. Lynching became the area that I was most concerned about because it was the thing that we were most silent about in America. And I guess I just felt like we have to make this visible. That's what gave rise to this idea of creating a memorial that would expose people in a very intense way to this history of lynching. And for me, going to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, I wanted it to speak to the anguish and the pain in a very direct way. The monuments begin at eye level in the first quarter, and they rise as we were walking down, and they rise even more. And now you're standing underneath of this history. People who carried out these lynchings could have buried the bodies in the ground and gotten away with more violence. But hanging was preferred because it lifted these bodies up to terrorize and menace and taunt communities of color. People would pose with the brutalized bodies after they conducted this violence. They were proud to have tortured and menaced these folks. What was that about? I mean, you've thought about this. What would Freud say was really going on there? I think there was such animosity, such bitterness, such hatred at the idea that someone was forcing them to accept the equality of black people, that they had to express this rage. Who comprised a lynch mob? It wasn't the Klan. It wasn't the extremists. It was the farmers. It was frequently teachers. It was law enforcement officers. It was the business leaders. It was clergy. It was anybody who was part of that community. We haven't been able to change the narrative about slavery. What makes you optimistic about changing the narrative about lynching? I think that narrative is going to change as we begin to show this brutality. We haven't created spaces in America that motivate people when they go through it to say never again to racial violence and racial hierarchy. And that's, for me, the reason why things like the memorial and museums like this that are direct in presenting this legacy and violence of lynching become necessary. I want us to tell the truth about our history, not because I want to punish America. I want to liberate us, but we can't get to liberation if we don't acknowledge what we've done.
The frequency and brutality of violence against African Americans is sickening to contemplate. A distinctly American phenomenon, lynchings increased in the years after Reconstruction, peaking in the early 1890s and remaining a source of terror deep into the 20th century.